The women's movement in the United States helped them to gain their rights. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 was the first time that women organized. Nearly 300 women attended this convention. Here, the Declaration of Rights of Women was drafted. This sought for more social, civil, and moral rights for women. The role of women in the 18th century was different from prior roles. Before the Seneca Falls Convention, women organized boycotts, assisted orphans and widows, and fundraised. The Seneca Falls Convention changed this. Women started to take a stand, advocating for their own rights. However, women did not mix in politics, as it was a man-dominated society. Women during this time got most of their political information from their husbands and from their fathers. Not all women were given these rights, though. It was heavily dependent on social class. Only those women who were given a class position and personal access to politicians could seek favors for their organizations. Black women's groups, for example, had no entree to the political process. The Declaration of Rights of Women vastly outweighed the ideas of the old. Later, in the 1920s, the National Women's Party was formed. Their platform was through the works of Susan B. Anthony. This was a demonstration of first-wave feminism. Women's rights domestically were challenged. Issues included child labor protection, prenatal care for mothers, among many others. Women marched in the streets and held parades to help their cause to be known. Later, in the 1940s and 50s, the Congress of American Women Party, also known as the CAW, was formed. Their slogan was, 10 women anywhere can organize anything. They believed in the power of groups. The CAW focused on social justice issues, especially racial equality and economic justice. The CAW called for Commission of Status of Women, federal training programs for poor women, equal pay for poor women, equal pay in the labor market, access to public schooling, national health insurance, and child care for working women were among many of their demands. Women's norms shifted again in the 1950s, especially regarding motherhood. Males were the breadwinners and heads of the family, and a great amount of patriarchy was demonstrated. Shows such as I Love Lucy and Leave It to Beaver featured these norms. Women became increasingly frustrated at being second fiddle, and in the New York Times article of Annie Quinlan, she wrote, "While you sit on your ass making the revolution, I'm out there in the kitchen like a slave. What we need is a revolution in the house." In addition, women began attending universities. They were trying to better themselves, but in reality gained the Mrs. degree, which is to find a man to be a suitable husband. This became very contradicting because many men didn't want women to be outside of the household. The women's suffrage movement in Britain mimics that of the United States. Women were allowed to vote, yet this right was revoked in 1832. This created a huge uproar and began the fight for the franchise. The women's suffrage movement was first propelled by the popular feminist Mary Wollstonecraft. In 1792, she wrote and published A Vindication of the Rights of Women. This sparked an interest in women's rights and prompted citizens in Britain to challenge current thoughts. A group of working-class citizens formed an advocacy group called the Chartists. The Chartists approached Parliament with a petition and advocated that the franchise be granted to all men above the age of 21. This motion was finally passed and served as an exemplar of what could come for women in the future. The first bill of women's suffrage was presented in the House of Commons in 1870. After much debate, the first suffrage-related gains were made in 1881. The right to vote was granted solely to women who owned property. This was very limited, and limited to few women, as most lived with their families or husband who owned the property. Most women were still excluded from the right to vote, and as time progressed, many became outraged. British women began to form groups in order to combat this inequality. By 1897, various local and national suffrage organizations began to develop. Emmeline Pankhurst, along with her daughters, created the most significant and impactful organization in 1903. They formed the Women's Social and Political Movement, also known as the WSPU. It was unlike any former movement because it was a militant suffrage movement, which was far less peaceful. The WSPU utilized extreme tactics, which included, but were not limited to, street protests, meetings held in the streets, public verbal attack and ridicule of political speakers, and most popularly, hunger strikes. Women would starve themselves for days in the cities to gain the attention of other citizens and influential politicians. Women's actions became violent in nature. They gathered in the streets for years in hopes that they would gain the right to vote and it would be granted to all women equally. When World War I broke out, the women's suffrage efforts ceased almost completely. This was because women's suffrage movements came together and joined in their efforts to support the war. Violent and harsh tactics were set aside in favor of military action. When the masses of men left to fight on the front lines, industrial and production jobs were left empty. Like women in the United States, British women happily took on the jobs of men and worked in the factories to make weapons, food, and necessary products. The women who did not work in the cities worked on the front lines. Many women held nursing and cooking positions on the front lines at war. Emmeline Pankhurst negotiated with the British government, and in return for women's efforts in the war, several suffragettes were released from jail. Following the end of World War I, in 1918, partial suffrage was granted to as follows. A woman had to be over the age of 30 and had to own or rent property for a rate of at least £55 per year. A woman could also qualify to vote if she was the wife of a property owner who had passed away, or if she was a university graduate. This allowed 8.5 million British women to vote in the election of 1918. However, activists still were not pleased with these limited rights. They continued their fight, and in 1928, any woman over the age of 21 was granted the right to vote. This was granted under the Equal Franchise Act.
Women in the United States and Great Britain have put forth great effort and have made substantial progress in their pursuit of political equality, yet they are still highly underrepresented. The gender gap was one of the topics I focused on in my research. When analyzing the gender gap, I looked at 3 specific political areas where men and women differ. They differ in their voting practices, their party identification, and the importance they place on policy issues. Research shows that there is no gender gap in the voting practices of men and women in Great Britain. Although voter turnout is generally low, the men and women who do vote do so at the same rates. The Center for American Women in Politics reports that since 1980, women have proportionally voted at higher rates than men in every presidential election, and since 1986, women have proportionally voted more than men in every non-presidential election. Through my research, I found that women in the United States, as well as Great Britain, identify more with the Democratic Party than with the Conservative, and their ideology is more liberal than men's. The difference in ideology and party identification is partially attributed to the traditional gender roles of society. Multiple studies have found that women in the United States are less likely to support any form of aggression, capital punishment, or involvement in foreign wars. Women are supportive of government involvement in the economy so as to ensure good jobs and a certain standard of living, to reduce income difference, and to increase government services in general. Studies on women in Great Britain have found that they are more likely to prioritize education and healthcare issues, whereas men are more likely to prioritize the economy as their most important election issue. Another topic I focused on was how women can achieve political equality. According to Joni Lowandowski and Jeffrey Evans, there are specific strategies. They include political party equality rhetoric, equality promotion, and equality guarantees through the use of quotas or positive discrimination. While all of these strategies can be implemented, the issue of supply and demand comes into play. While the demand for qualified women may be high, the supply may not be. Richard Fox and Jennifer Lawless were able to identify some barriers that highly qualified women face when attempting to enter politics. Their study reports that since the political culture has not embraced women in the public sphere, highly qualified women feel a heightened level of discomfort when attempting to enter into politics. This is a likely result of traditional gender role orientation, which discourages women's candidacies. Another barrier to women's equal representation in politics is the long-standing patriarchal design and ideology of American and British politics. It has a history of intimidating, discouraging, and alienating women from entering into or being successful in politics. So why is it important that women be equally represented politically? Many women feel their gender needs and concerns can only be adequately represented by women. With more women in politics and in decision-making positions, the issues that are important to women have a better chance of being addressed.